Wayne, how you doing, man?
Good. How about you, Tyler?
Doing very well. I gotta
Awesome.
say, such a cool idea to do a phone call as a podcast. I can't say that I've ever thought about it, but when
Yeah.
thinking about it, I'm like, damn, there's 100 phone calls that I wish would have been recorded.
Yeah. Yeah. Just for yourself. And then, yeah, if you've got a podcast or even, YouTube or putting them up for other people to listen to, yeah, there's a lot of value in those, sharing them that way.
So much learning.
Yeah.
Agreed. Unfiltered too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm excited to jump into this topic with you because, we've looked at this one a lot and there isn't really black and white clear answers sometimes around terpenes, especially when you get into
Yeah.
the processing and some of the products. So it's always a fun topic to dive into. So I'm curious to, give you some feedback and then hear what you've been, finding in your research and things you guys have been looking at as well.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what I have is questions.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to kind of follow your lead on the conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah, I think, and for people that are listening, kind of the summary, and when you reached out, it was around, I think, terpenes in your products and wondering, one, how volatile they are, what's actually making it over, and then the big reason of, why adding terpenes is the effects or the change of state of different products it can have. And so there's a lot around terpenes, and they're becoming much more known, I think, by consumers as well. People are starting to look for them. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
I
I'll use the word.
Yeah.
I'll just say there's a word that I use often. I want to make sure it's clear, which is a state change, and I'm talking about a physiological change for an individual. So
Mm.
if I'm feeling anxious, a state change would be going to the mood that is calm and relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm awake, a state change would be sleeping.
Yeah.
So when we develop products, we want to really create products that have a state change
Mm-hmm.
effect, mainly because that's the experience that is most compelling to someone who's in need of any sort.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say a state change. And as it relates to terpenes, that's, like you mentioned, one of the biggest questions. Is it actually going to have efficacy? And if it does,
Yeah.
how much? What format? Like, there's so many details to make something actually work.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of the holy grail. And that's a good way to refer to it, that state change. And kind of, I've heard people say needs based, products and formulations. And it's difficult because it's not a black or white. That state change is on a spectrum. I've described some of our products as, we might have kind of a uplifting one or a relaxing one, but it's not, if you're already really tired and you take the uplifting one, it's not going to make you jump out of bed at midnight and, you have all this energy. It kind of,
Right.
but it influences you in one direction or the other. Is kind of the goal. So if you're already kind of in the morning or going about your day, this would be a better approach than something that is more relaxing potentially. So it's a difficult thing to dial in for sure. But I thought to start, those are kind of the main categories I think we'll dive into, and I've got some different points and things we've found over time. But something else you said in the email was kind of getting a whole mixed bag of opinions from different people and the research that you've done. So I thought to start, maybe if you just want to ask the most, maybe confusing or different answers you've got to the same question, like what's really stood out to you as being one more of the difficult things to tackle around that.
Yeah, and I'm asking these questions from the perspective of somebody that's trying to make a product to help people, which I think is always important to understand the context in which a question is being asked.
Mm.
So when I think about, a product that's going to help people, the most requested product that we have at Jupiter is gummies, and we don't currently have gummies. And the reason we don't have gummies is because we felt that the science did not show efficacy based on bioavailability.
Mm.
So for what most people probably realize, that just means the product isn't in a high enough quantity or the ingredients are in a high enough quantity to actually have the physiological effect to say that it's actually making an impact.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to gummies, it's going down the first pass filter, and so the enzymes and everything's happening, and every product and every ingredient is different as it relates to this. But for our oils, we use the sublingual method, again based on bioavailability. Okay, so we move into these gummies, right?
Mm-hmm.
We did all of this research on what ingredients at what levels have clinical evidence to say that they're working. So one of the more interesting ones for, say, anxiety is saffron. There's companies that sell saffron extracts that have clinical studies that actually show efficacy. Great, that's really interesting. That's an ingredient that we're going to do a lot of research and development around. So then we keep going. We eventually find terpenes as basically making the claims. So question number one, why are there not very many clinical studies, if any, because I couldn't find any, around the efficacy of terpenes in terms of mood, stress, and then sleep?
Yeah. There's definitely some out there. What I've noticed, one of the biggest issues is that pretty much all of the studies around terpenes are based on around aromatherapy. And so you don't have, then when you look at like actual hemp or cannabis products, it's a different form state that you're consuming that in. So aromatherapy is, room temperature. It's kind of evaporated into the air. You're inhaling it into the lungs. Even from, an inhalation product, you're applying heat to it. And then when you talk about edibles or tinctures, now you're consuming that terpene in a way that hasn't really been done in the past. I mean, it has naturally through like the food and fruit or fruit produce type products, but it's really all the studies have been around aromatherapy. I think just because the health and wellness industry, that's what they've been used for. Essential oils is a very common term in health and wellness, and people have a vaporizer. And so that's where most of the studies like on a specific terpene lie. And then in food or tincture products where you're, orally or sublingually consuming them, just not a lot has been done. And then you add another really interesting dynamic, which is the synergy effect with the cannabinoids. And then that gets very complex at different doses. I mean, the countless number of terpenes and cannabinoids that you could study together in that way. And then the consumption methods is another dynamic layer. So it gets really complex there. And
so that may be the answer to that, is that there's just the level of complexity required in the amount of companies that exist that are willing to do that research, maybe the funding that's been put towards it, on and on and on as to why. So let's say I'm willing to accept that we're just a little bit too far on the edge. And as an entrepreneur, I'm willing to work in that space to say there's not a ton of evidence. Otherwise, the space would be ultra saturated and hard to really build a business. But I don't want to create a product that's just BS, no efficacy, all marketing and hype. There's too much of that already. So then let's go to the next phase and say, okay, well, hypothetically, they're really effective if they make it to where they need to be in the body. So then I start going down the let's just call it the supply chain. When these are manufactured by one of the major companies, whether it be True Terpenes, whether it be Ivana or one of the other major terpene manufacturers, what do they need to do in order to protect, say, the monoterpenes, mono being like the very tiny ones that are very fragile and easily, I don't know if the word is dissolved or burn off or whatnot. What needs to be done to protect those terpenes, the full spectrum of terpenes, as it moves to the co-packer who's going to say, make the gummy or make the tincture or make whatever the product is going into. And then I'm sure you can predict the next couple questions. How do they make sure not to in any way damage the terpenes? How do we make sure that we package it in a way where it stays live in the supply chain? And then how long is it realistically going to stay alive in the supply chain? And then all of that kind of backs into the question of, well, how much you need to put in the first place.
Right.
So I don't know how you want to tackle that, but
yeah, it's a good set of questions to work through, and that kind of covers, if we're going to make the assumption that they are working, how do we ensure that they get through in the right dose through the right consumption method? To start at the beginning of the supply chain, I would say when you're sourcing that isolate terpene, it's highly concentrated from True Terpenes or wherever you get them from. If it's a quality supplier, you're getting a quality product when that terpene comes in the bottle. It's at 99, 98% potency in that extract isolate form. When it's sealed in that bottle, it's pretty much good in there. It's going to stay in that form. It's not going to escape until you open that bottle, and some of it, you can smell it. They're very aromatic, which is why you get that smell from them so much, and especially in like the flower. You can smell the differences there.
And I will say, just to jump in there, that all the companies that I've spoke to to this point say that they nitrogen top seal the bottles, which I believe that means it's essentially a barrier between oxygen. So the top layer of the oil does not have any degradation from oxidization.
Yeah.
But as you said, as soon as that bottle opens,
Mm-hmm.
nitrogen's gone. The liquid is now exposed.
Yep. Yep, exactly. Yeah, nitrogen's basically an inert gas that's used in a lot of to preserve things in that way because it just doesn't interact with almost anything. So that definitely helps if they're doing that as well. But it then basically all the issues or problems arise after that bottle's opened downstream through the manufacturing process. And so there's two different things with terpenes. So the one you were asking about, I think in the email, is kind of its boiling point, which is, water boils at 212 degrees. So there's some boiling point where those terpenes are just going to quickly escape and be burned off, maybe another term we could use, in the manufacturing process. Most of the boiling points actually for terpenes are really high. I think most of them are above 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of them are above like 250. They get a little bit lower, but almost all of them boil at a higher point than water does. And so everything you're doing, you have to look at the specific process because depending on the product type, if it's a gummy, a tincture, when and where they're added, what temperature is the process at that they're being added to, for how long, and until what point do you seal them in the final product. All those variables will play in. But what's kind of also important is the boiling point or the temperature which they really burn off at isn't the only consideration. There's also the evaporation point, or it gets a little complex, but I remember in chemistry, like surface tension of molecules or where they evaporate at is another factor. And that for terpenes is actually much lower, which is why they're so aromatic and you smell them so easily off the plant or out of that bottle, even though it's not at its boiling point yet. And actually, most people understand this difference in this example. So if you leave a bowl of water out in the sun, within a couple of days, that water evaporates. It's gone, although it never got to 212 degrees and actually boiled. And so that explains how that, much lower evaporation temperature can still burn off water, even though it never got up to that boiling point, which is kind of what we normally would think is, well, that's when it actually evaporates, is at the boiling point. Everything normally will evaporate before the boiling point, and then it depends on what the molecule is, so these terpenes are much more aromatic. And I was doing some reading, and a lot of these terpenes actually evaporate around like 70 degrees to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or even lower. So evaporation is essentially, they're evaporating off the surface of the liquid, versus a boiling point, kind of the whole liquid mass or the whole body of it is evaporating. So that's kind of the difference there.
Okay, so I'm thinking in terms of form factor.
Mm-hmm.
That is true for the oil that the terpene is maybe diffused into.
Mm-hmm.
So say you have a specific oil that is like a calm blend,
mm-hmm.
and say it has 6 different terpenes in it. And those terpenes, actually, a little side note, I know that when certain terpenes come in contact with themselves,
mm-hmm.
they can actually bond and then change. Their chemical compound will change, and they will no longer be the original terpene. There'll be a different type, and then the effects of it, the smell, everything changes, which is an interesting point because, again, if you're trying to control everything in a manufacturing process, even having it in its liquid form, it will start to alter if it is not exposed to UV or if it's not exposed to oxygen. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying about the water is really interesting because you can leave anything in the sun for a couple of days, and if you take it out of the sun and look at it before and after, the sun has an effect on it. So UV is incredibly damaging to a lot of stuff. So what I've been told by the terpene companies is that UV is far more damaging than anything else. So the primary thing is to keep it out of UV light.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying, as far as if you can smell it, it's obviously being released. It's like those terpenes are obviously being propagated throughout, the room or wherever it's being. It's off gassing. I don't know what the correct terms are here. Yeah. But essentially, the question then to me becomes: is there a way? So, like, we don't do vapes for many reasons. Mm-hmm. But if you say seal this terpene liquid in another liquid, and then you put this in a probably oxygen evacuated little glass cartridge, I would imagine that then the terpene content stays higher because it's completely unexposed to oxygen and assumably unexposed to light. Mm-hmm. It should in theory last much longer. Does the same thing that one, is that true? And then 2, could the same thing apply if you put it into a gummy? Does the gummy format in any way protect the terpene through the supply chain until the consumer receives it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, anything that you completely seal off and isolate, especially from new oxygen entering, is definitely going to help. Or UV light. So if you have an opaque glass versus clear bottle or something like that, it's definitely going to help. Storage conditions in that scenario, if someone leaves it on the windowsill where it's getting direct sunlight, can be an issue. But if you think about like that evaporation happening in the liquid form, which if that's a tincture form, it's going to be more likely to kind of gas off or evaporate than if it's in a solid form, like a gummy or an edible. But the other issue is it's a little harder when you're dealing with the temperatures of making a gummy or an edible to control it at that point versus, maybe your tincture, you can put it in at the very end of the process when it's really cooled down quite a bit and then just mix it up a little. And so I wouldn't worry as much about the tincture being open to the atmosphere and some of it getting out. It's actually very small amounts that we can actually smell. They're very potent in that way. So even if you get that smell when you open the bottle, it's not that they're all escaping or, you're losing a lot of it, because also I think there's a benefit to having that smell before consumption. It kind of sets and primes the mind or the body because they work through aromatherapy as well. So when you mix in opening that bottle and smelling some of that, maybe before you consume it, might actually also be a benefit to that process, which you wouldn't really get with a gummy or a solid form factor in that way. And so yeah, I think that that's still okay if you're smelling it when you open it, because it's not that a lot of the terpenes are escaping. It's just a little bit needs to, and you'll still get that smell from it.
Got it. So, and then I suppose the last question, which in some ways could be the first question, is there any studies that you're familiar with? And I can tell you what the company's told me as far as I think question number one, to just make this a complete conversation, what is your understanding of the bioavailability of a gummy, assuming that it's chewed slowly? Because that is, I know, important. If, say, you just swallow it whole, being an extreme, chewing it very slowly, letting it dissolve in your mouth, that there's clearly a spectrum there. So let's say that you chew it slowly and don't swallow it immediately. You kind of just savor the taste. What do you understand as being the bioavailability of that? And if you want to break that question down into probably some contextual questions that are probably necessary. Yeah,
there's a lot of different factors that I've tried to understand that more, because bioavailability was kind of a big topic, especially around marketing. Well, still is, but I've seen the last few years becoming a bigger and bigger topic, and nano encapsulation is another category, and the marketing on that as well, that improves the bioavailability of your cannabinoids or maybe your terpenes if they're nano encapsulated. And the theory is it's passing, and this is used in other drug forms and factors, so it's fairly proven method, but it basically passing the first stage of metabolism so that more of it gets through and passes into the bloodstream. And so I kind of view nano encapsulation and sublingual consumption to be somewhat similar potentially in bioavailability. But there's a lot of factors, and I can't say black or white that one is better or one has more bioavailability, because even that topic alone, when they actually measure that and they say this is 50% more bioavailable, what they're looking at is the metabolites in the bloodstream of maybe a specific cannabinoid. I think normally it's THC that they're looking at when they talk bioavailability, maybe CBD as well, but they're downstream metabolites. And so now you're getting into a question of, okay, you're showing 50% more of those metabolites downstream, in the bloodstream, but is that the only factor where those cannabinoids are interacting with the body? I mean, it may be by not metabolizing it in that first stage or that first pass, you're losing some effects of, how the cannabinoids could work or the terpenes. And so these are kind of two different categories, the terpenes versus the cannabinoids. Of how they might be bioavailable. And then you got to mix in is it an isolate product where it's just CBD isolate in there, or is it a little THC, some terpenes as well? In an edible like a gummy, is it, a fat-based edible versus a gummy, which isn't, fat-based cannabinoids and terpenes are fat soluble. So in theory, maybe more bioavailable. If you've ever heard consume some fat with an edible, if it's not a fat-based edible, can help a little bit. And so those are a bunch of different factors that kind of play into this bioavailability conversation. I do think when it comes to terpenes specifically, this is just a guess, but they're probably more bioavailable through sublingual consumption. I would bet that, and it depends on the terpene, but more of them are probably broke down through the metabolism process than if you get them sublingually, which is more kind of skipping that step of metabolism. But at the same time, a lot of terpenes are in fruits and vegetables, and you're orally consuming those. So are those having still that same benefit or a different benefit potentially, through going through the digestive phase in the body? So it's a really hard question. Another thing around THC specifically, everyone, edibles and tinctures, they'll have delta-9 THC in the product. And if you sublingually consume that, mostly delta-9 will go through, sublingual absorption, or if you nano-encapsulate, what they get is delta-9 skipping that first stage of metabolism. But one thing we know for sure with THC is when it does metabolize through an edible or oral consumption, it actually converts to 11-hydroxy THC, which is a more potent form, right? Yeah, and it's a little easier. That's more psychoactive. And so that's skipping that phase if you, you could say it's more bioavailable if you skip that metabolism, but you're also not getting the 11-hydroxy, which is a different form, which could be beneficial. Maybe you want in certain cases, maybe you don't in others. And so just from that kind of string of listing things off, you can see how just looking at bioavailability is a hard question to answer with what we know right now, and it depends on the use case. And maybe you want it in certain scenarios or not in others, depending on the form factor. But when it comes to terpenes, I think they're more available when you're not metabolizing them, is just my guess and my feeling from what we've looked at.
It's a good point. One side note, I got to know 11-hydroxy very personally over a three-day period of time on accident once. Wasn't a good time. But what I love about this conversation is that the question that I'm asking, I know it doesn't have a simple answer. Mm-hmm. And so while you're not giving me an absolute direct answer, you're giving me the structure for an answer. Mm. And unfortunately, when you speak to companies, they're often like, if I'm like, what's the bioavailability? They're like, oh, it's 50%. I'm like, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
It's like, I know there's no way that's a true answer, but like, that's unfortunately also the answer that the consumer is willing to accept because they're so busy, as we all are, living life, that we can't, get super hyper focused on these individual decisions, mm-hmm. which for us, again, our brand is about efficacy and doing this hard research first, mm-hmm. and not giving people bad products. Like, it's essentially a trust process, but it requires us to find somebody like you who can say, the question you're asking is a good question, and there's not a single answer. Yeah. So here's what you have to think about. And then it's a matter of optimizing for outcomes. Mm-hmm. So to this point, the other thing that we always try to use is testing. Mm-hmm. And we try to do as much testing as possible, which we couldn't do early on because it's really cost prohibitive. Mm-hmm. But we've gotten to a point now where the cost of doing lab testing is not cost prohibitive for us. So we lean into the idea of saying, okay, XYZ company claimed XYZ, but we're going to send it to this third-party lab and get a legitimate answer from them. Okay, so we do this, and then the lab results are like, whoa, this isn't even close to what they claimed. So you go back to that company and say, hey, what's the deal here? Like, here's the lab report. You can see it. It is not the same. And their answer is they just don't have the right equipment settings. And then you got to say, oh, well, that, there was a cost in doing this. So do we go back to that company and say, the mass spec settings need to be this specific thing? Mm-hmm. And of course, the company is willing to offer to do the testing for you. But if you're looking for truth, you obviously want to get rid of the bias opinion that they may have. So when it comes to testing terpenes, my question is, one, if you can recommend a lab, I would love that. Mm-hmm. But two, is it, because this is coming from someone at a company who said, it is very, very hard to accurately test for terpenes. Mm-hmm. And then that question breaks down into, if I am testing the raw liquid, or am I testing the gummy after 1 month, 2 months, 6 months on shelf, mm-hmm. to see what the degradation is over time? Mm-hmm. What's your thought on that type of testing, if it's viable, or if there is somebody, that's willing to do it? Yeah. Testing is difficult right off the bat because you have a lot of new labs springing up. Like, this hasn't really been a focus of
stringent testing until a lot of these cannabis regulations were put in place. And labs in general are more focused on cannabinoids. And I think testing for terpenes is a much looser, there's not clear rules, regulations around it. So there's a lot more opinions kind of floating about on how to do this. It might also be something that getting that clear answer might not be necessary, because you do have a pretty good sized window of efficacy for like dose and how much you're actually getting, where it'll become effective. But, certain drugs over consuming is THC, for example. I mean, you really need to dial in that dose. If you're getting extra terpenes or a little less, maybe it's not going to hurt that if, state change or something as much. But I will say, or actually I had a quick question. So that test you were talking about, was that on like the end isolate terpene that you got from a company, and then you were just testing the potency?
Blend.
It was a blend. Okay.
The blend, yeah, blend for quantities of each terpene.
And how many terpenes did they have in that blend? Was it set to mimic like a strain or something?
No, it was six, and it was essentially a state change terpene. So it was designed to elicit a state change.
Okay. I would recommend, for the most part, using terpene isolates and making your own blend.
Interesting.
Because I think those isolates are just much more, you're getting them in a high potency, and it's more consistent. When the companies start blending, there's not really regulations for them as far as I understand. So when they get a result, where are they testing that at? You're testing at a different lab. And so it gets a little trickier there. So I think personally,
that's really good advice. Thank you.
Yeah. Start with the isolates, make your own. That's what we've always done. And I think the holy grail, if you can do it, is getting the end product tested for the terpene content, not the starting isolate or the blend. That's also a lot harder to do. And a lot of labs either don't know how. I've tried to find labs to test our edibles, the end product, for terpene content, and most have told me they can't do it. There is a lab in Central Oregon. It's called Juniper Labs. Juniper, like the tree. I think it's Juniper, and they were actually able to test our edible. We have a caramel, which is kind of complex because it's fat-based, butter that's in there, a lot of sugar content, and the terpenes also are at much lower doses than the cannabinoids. So you're talking like, 5-10 milligrams or something. It's pretty low content when it's in a bigger edible like form factor. I think your tinctures would probably be easier to terpene test. But I would reach out to that lab and they even told me when they tested ours, we got results back similar to what I thought they should be based on like our, a mass balance of how much we were adding. So that was cool to see, but they did say, this might be a little unreliable. We could test the same one twice and you'll get kind of varying results on potency. But at least to show that the specific terpene is showing up in the end product is good to know, because then your manufacturing process is set up correctly, that it is actually carrying over. So I'd reach out to that lab and see what they say around your specific product, if they can test it for terpenes, and ask other labs, can you test a tincture for terpenes?
Thanks for that lead, because the lab industry is interesting, where there's a lot of resellers of lab testing, and it's hard to find the actual source sometimes. So if Juniper is a source, that's amazing. I'll definitely reach out to them.
Yeah. I would probably labs, I would mostly only look at labs in cannabis regulated states, because they have just so much more oversight, and they are focused on cannabis specifically. So they're thinking just cannabinoids and terpenes for the most part. When you get other labs coming in, like on the hemp side of the industry, they're labs that were already established. They're like, oh, we'll add this on as another offering, and they're just not as specialized in it. And that's where I see way more variance when you look at hemp labs, or it's not a cannabis regulated lab. So that might help also filter a little bit labs to look at.
That is helpful. Thank you. I guess one other question that I have, which again is one of the more important questions, what is the milligram amount that you feel is necessary, or that maybe you've seen clinical studies on, or any type of study on, or even anecdotal at this point, that would suggest like what is the efficacious amount to include?
Yeah.
If it's going to be an edible.
Yeah.
But this is the bioavailability question.
Yeah. What I've always tried to do is just mimic what's in the flower. And I think the cannabis plant, they are growing craft hemp that is much higher in terpenes now. It's kind of a new category versus industrial hemp, which they basically grow to make CBD isolate. Really low terpene, if any, content in that. And so when you look at the cannabis plant, you'll see like, if you go into I think are you in Colorado? So you have dispensaries around there?
Los Angeles.
Okay, so
Yeah.
there's dispensaries
Los
there.
Angeles,
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So if you go into any dispensary and you got to find one that actually shows terpene results for the flower, sometimes that's also hard to find. But that seems to be growing, dispensaries and growers that are putting that on the label. But you'll see like, if the THC's 20%, your terpene content, like high terpene flower is like 3% total terpenes in the flower, and as low as maybe 1%, maybe slightly under that for a decent terpene content. And so I'll just try to mimic that ratio in the edible. So if, THC is 20% and terpenes are 2%, that's a tenth the amount, basically, of how much terpenes I would add when I'm looking at how much cannabis or hemp I'm adding, CBD, THC, whatever it is, and just try to keep that similar ratio for the dose, because I think you're mimicking what's in nature, and so it's probably the best you can get on figure out what's the right dose, because terpenes are very potent, and if you over add them, they're pretty solvent as well, and can actually at too high of a dose be pretty dangerous. You should never consume like a terpene extract on its own.
Yeah.
If you ever put a glass dropper into a extract of terpene, or not glass, plastic, it'll dissolve the plastic, which when you see that, you're like, oh, okay, these things are a little more, they're definitely potent little molecules.
Yeah, even reading the SDS sheet on the terpenes, I was like, damn, these things are corrosive and all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why a small amount. But they're also terribly expensive too. So again, when you're thinking as someone trying to create a product that's going to market, needs to be affordable, et cetera, it's a big question of figuring out. I do not want it to be like a hype ingredient with no efficacy, and so you want to make sure you have the right amount. But again, like it's as it stands, and I don't know how much this information is helpful. It's looking at the terpene content alone is going to be between 50 to 70% of our ingredient cost, and it is not the only like main functional ingredient that we have in these gummies. So we're trying really hard to make these gummies for the gummies right now, if we were using good business practices in terms of running like profitably and all that stuff, it'd have to be like $69 to like $75 for 30 gummies. So, and I start to think that price is just out of the market.
Yeah. So your cost on the terpenes with how talking to these companies and how much you should add is almost half your cost of goods sold just from the terpenes and the dose they're recommending?
To be clear, just the ingredient cost.
Okay.
So it's not even the cost of manufacturing, not the cost of bottling, not the cost of the bottle. So not cost of goods, but the cost of ingredients.
Yeah.
But to be clear, the other ingredients that we're including, like there's proprietary ingredients, there are like other ingredients that are not cheap ingredients, which is what's making the overall bottle cost this insane amount that then has to be reflected in retail price. But then that's where I get to the point of, if we're going to go down that route, which is the only route we take, it has to work.
Yeah.
Because if someone pays $74 for a bottle of gummies, and we're not early in this, but we're still at the point where we may be able to find ways to make it less expensive, with negotiations and partnerships and stuff like that. But it's always a big question because, sometimes people will say, if it's that expensive, it must be real, which is faulty logic, because I've seen a lot of products in the market that are great packaging, but no punch. And vice versa. Sometimes you find really great products and the founder's just not operationally sharp enough to say, you've got to charge enough so you can continue to run your business. And, you got to be profitable to do that. So anyways, that might not be contextually relevant to this conversation, but it's really important, I guess, for us that when we bring a product to market, we want that product to stay available. And part of that is making sure that we have the necessary margin to continue to produce it. And for our partners, for their employees, for literally everybody in the supply chain to live.
Yeah.
And that sometimes prices things out of the market, out of reach of the people who may need it the most.
Yeah.
It's a really hard back and forth battle to kind of make.
Yeah. It sounds to me like your terpene suppliers either overcharging you. And I think when you buy those blends, you do pay a premium versus the isolates and just making your own blend. Or they're telling you to add too much dose wise. So I just pulled up our our gross margin calculator on our edibles because that terpene cost sounded high to me. And so the way we dose, based on mimicking what would be naturally found in the flower, those ratios, I see like the cannabinoid cost for us is, I'll use simple numbers here, but let's say it's 50 cents for the cannabinoids. Our food ingredients are around like 20 cents, and then the terpene costs are like 10 cents or 15 cents. So it's quite a bit smaller than even the cannabinoids or the food costs, and that's not factoring in packaging and other things either. So I've always found our terpenes actually be a fairly low-cost ingredient to add in, and not really affected, our margins like that. So
I think that it is partly due to, well, we're talking to several different companies, but none of them would get anywhere close to those type of numbers, even if those numbers are just representative of percentages and not actual real dollar numbers. We're not even in that. We're not even close. So it may be the milligram amount that we're looking to add is part of it. I may not be getting the best quoted pricing, which may be part of it. And I may be actually buying, you're right, I may be buying inventory that is priced based on prestige rather than being priced based on actual cost for them.
Yeah.
So when I say we're not early, but I'm not at the point where I'm ready to move forward with anybody yet, because just hearing that is very helpful.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, we use True Terpenes. That is who we source from. So, and, but yeah, I think I've looked at their blends before, and I do know, those will increase the cost, but it might just be that you're looking at adding too much potentially, because it really doesn't take much of the terpenes, assuming what you add is actually carrying over. So there could be an issue there.
That lies the question, because if we go back to that bioavailability thing, if I put in, 10 milligrams and 1 milligram makes it into the bloodstream because of everything that happens in the supply chain plus bioavailability, then I have to include 30 in order for it to be 3.
Right.
You see but that's the thing. We don't know that math. And so,
yeah,
at the end of the day, this is maybe a good place to wrap. We have an amazing base of customers who I have really good relationships with. I do tons of personal customer service as a founder. And so we have people who have returned product over the years for what I would call non-efficacy. They just didn't get the results they were looking for. Those are the first people that we reach out to when we have new products to do testing. And so I feel like that's a good place to start, because we can sometimes, if we find something that's working for the hardest customer who literally asks for their money back, that if we can help them, then I feel like it's a great place for us to continue to do more testing.
Yeah.
It's a high bar, but I think that's necessary for the pricing that we may end up at.
Yeah, it's a good process. And I think for the adding the terpenes, a couple of tips. If you can do it at the end of the manufacturing process, when it's cooled down and then you just have to mix it in, heat is basically going to be your biggest detriment in time. At what temperature for how long after you add those terpenes. So if you can add it at the end when it's cooled, just mix it. And then one other tip, like for us, we have to add it in while the caramel is hot, because a cooled caramel is, solid by that point. I can't add terpenes in then.
Yeah.
So what we do is make like terpene butter, so that when it is added at the temperature, it's not the terpene isolate liquid that hits the pot and just, flashes and we lose a lot of it. That butter goes in cool. Now it's kind of encapsulated inside of that caramel, matrix that's being mixed, and we're not above the boiling point. So now that it's inside the liquid, we're just losing a lot less. So it's kind of another way to try to get it in there without losing it to evaporation.
That is helpful. And that's really helpful.
And one thing I'll say on as far as the state change or, the efficacy of terpenes on their own, if you ever have you heard the phrase, the nose knows? That term about kind of...
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually very reliable. It's almost solely how I shop for cannabis. I love when they have terpene results to look at, but when stores don't, if you looked at a flower strain that, 3 strains, they have the exact same cannabinoids, same potency of THC, CBD, whatever it is, and then you smell them, and they have different smells, and your body will kind of tell you. Like I lean towards like fruity, citrusy type smells, and those terpenes like limonene, I like pinene and terpinolene, some of those. You can have the exact same cannabinoids, but these different smells, which means different terpenes, and those effects are different when you consume that flower or smoke it. And so it tells you those terpenes are definitely doing something. And you're kind of just using like a trial and error testing R&D process to dial it in, to figure out that state change you're trying to aim for.
Yeah, and everybody's biochemistry is different anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that's why I think people can say that they get a different effect from the exact same product. Well, cool. This conversation has been really helpful. I'm happy if these make it into production and we get even benchtop samples. I'm happy to send them to you just to get your feedback and opinion.
Yeah, and if you find a good lab that can test terpenes, I've always been looking for them. And Juniper has done decent for us, but it's not something I think we were the first customer they ever tried to do it for. So it's definitely, I'd be interested if there's a lab out there that's like, oh yeah, we know how to do this. We've been looking at it.
Sure.
That'd be good to know.
If that's a way for me to provide value back to you for this phone call, I'll spend time on that. Awesome, Tyler. Well, yeah, it was great chatting with you. This was a fun conversation. It's been a little while since I've dived into the terpene science and thought about these, as we have over the years. So, and I think a lot of listeners will like this one because these are a lot of the questions we get. Terpenes and edibles, those don't even work, some people will say, and some people swear by them. It's a hard question.
It's a mix. Yeah, it's a mixed bag for sure. So this was fun.
The answer is almost never a yes or no.
Yeah,
There's
maybe.
always going to be a hell of a lot of context into how, when, where, and why.
Yeah.
So, cool, man. Well, again, I really appreciate it. Yeah, feel free to save the number. Call me anytime, and otherwise, I'll let you know if these make it into production.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good one, Tyler. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Wayne.
Yep.
See you, man.
Bye.